President Joe Biden declares to the world, America is back after many political upheavals under his predecessor, Donald Trump. But this commitment is shaky amid the debt ceiling crisis. Biden decided to cut short his Asia trip when he went to Japan to attend the G7 summit, but cancelled his schedule to visit Australia and Papua New Guinea, allies and partners of the U.S. in Asia Pacific. He needed to quickly return to the White House as the debt ceiling crisis is still unresolved. Domestic political issues continue to haunt Biden until the last moments of his official visit to Japan last week. As soon as he steps on Air Force One to leave Japan for the U.S. on May the 21st, he requested to arrange a call with the Speaker of the House to find a way to remove the risk of default. But this is not a strange situation for Biden. Domestic political issues often overshadow foreign trips and efforts to focus on global priorities of the U.S. president. Instead of showing the image of a strong commander of the world's most powerful economy, Biden went on a mission with anxiety, worry in his heart, eager to return home to prevent a potential disaster caused by Americans themselves. How the debt ceiling crisis overshadowed Biden's trip and shook America's position. Will China or even India seize the opportunity when U.S. influence declines? Please join us to find out in today's World Affairs. President Biden left for Japan last week for a meeting of the leaders of 7 major industrial democracies who get together each year to try to keep the world economy stable. But as it turns out, the major potential threat to global economic stability this year is the United States. When Mr. Biden lands in Hiroshima for the annual Group of 7 summit meeting on Thursday, the United States will be 2 weeks from a possible default that would jolt not only its own economy, but those of the other countries at the table. It will fall to Mr. Biden to reassure his counterparts that he will find a way to avoid that, but they understand it's not solely in his control. The showdown with Republicans over raising the federal debt ceiling has already upended the president's international diplomacy by forcing a last-minute cancellation of 2 stops he had planned to make after Japan, Papua New Guinea, and Australia. Rather than being the unchallenged commander of the most powerful superpower striding across the world stage, Mr. Biden will be an embattled leader forced to rush home to avert a catastrophe of Americans' own making. In the preparations leading up to the G7 meeting, officials from the other participating countries have not struck U.S. officials as all that alarmed about the possibility of default, perhaps because they trust Mr. Biden, knowing that the moment of truth is still a couple of weeks away, and assume that Washington wouldn't get its act together in time. But that simply underscores how much volatility has become the new norm in Washington. After generations of counting on the United States as the most important stabilizing force in world affairs, allies in recent years have increasingly come to expect a certain level of dysfunction instead. Extended government shutdowns, banking crisis, debt ceiling fight, and even political violence would once have been unthinkable, but have prompted foreign leaders to factor American unpredictability into their calculations. I think our biggest threat is us, said Jane Harman, a former Democratic representative from California, who later served as the president of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Our leadership in the world is being eroded by our internal dysfunction. The markets are still betting against our defaulting, and that is a decent bet. But if we only manage to eke out a short-term extension at the price its onerous budget caps, including on defense, we're going to be horrible when Ukraine needs at most and China is building beachheads everywhere. The White House warned that a default would only embolden America's adversaries using argument against Republicans, whom they blame for playing with fire. There are countries like Russia and China that would love nothing more than us to default, so they can point the finger and say, you see, the United States is not a stable, reliable partner, said John F. Kirby, a spokesman for the National Security Council. But he sought to play down the effects of the dispute on the G7 meeting, saying that he doubted it would dominate the discussion and maintaining that other leaders don't need to worry about the part of it. The president's counterparts would understand his need to cut short his trip, he said. They know that our ability to pay our debts is a key part of U.S. credibility and leadership around the world, Mr. Kirby said. And so they understand that the president also has to focus on making sure that we don't default and on having these conversations with congressional leaders. Even if they understand, although they see consequences, Mr. Biden's decision to head home only reinforces question about American commitment to the Asia-Pacific region and leaves a vacuum that China may exploit, according to analysts. A presidential visit to places like Papua New Guinea, where no U.S. leader has gone before, speaks loudly about diplomatic priorities, as does the failure to follow through. This is not the first time an American president has cropped a foreign trip to deal with domestic concerns. President George Bush canceled a 2-week trip to Asia in 1991 to show he was focused on a lagging economy at home. While President Bill Clinton scrapped a trip to Japan during a government shutdown in 1995, President Barack Obama delayed a trip to Indonesia and Australia in 2010 to focus on healthcare legislation, then scoped an Asia-Pacific summit meeting in 2013 during a government shutdown of its own. The perpetual culture of crisis in Washington, however, has grown only more intense since the arrival of President Donald Trump, who threatened to unravel bedrock alliance and embrace long-standing adversaries abroad while disrupting democratic norms and economic conventions at home. The debt ceiling showdown between Mr. Biden and Speaker Kevin McCarthy has underscored to the president peers that, however much he may seek to restore normalcy, U.S. politics has not returned to the steady state of the past, not least because Mr. Trump seeks to reclaim office in the next year's election. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said at a meeting of G7 finance ministers and central bankers in Japan last week that a default would spark a global downturn and risk undermining U.S. global economic leadership and raise questions about our ability to defend our national security interests. Mr. Biden, a veteran of half a century in high office in Washington, has regularly remarked on the uncertainty surrounding America's place in the world that he discovered when he took office after Mr. Trump's disruptive 4 years. America is back, he said. He would tell foreign counterparts only to hear, but for how long? By contrast to his predecessor, Mr. Biden has conducted a far more conventional foreign policy familiar to world leaders, and foreign officials see him as a more traditional U.S. president. But they also understand that his presiding over a country whose democracy has been tested and found to be fragile, and they see a fractious politics in Washington that values confrontation over compromise, even at the risk of something that would have once been unimaginable, like a default. When President Biden built on Friday's welcome dinner for G7 leaders after barely an hour, the White House said he was returning to his hotel for another briefing on debt limit talks back in Washington. The chatter on the ground was that he was just jet-lagged. Presidents are often required to juggle several things at once. Before beginning his final day at meetings in Hiroshima, Biden was briefed again on debt limit talks and instructed aides to schedule a phone call with GOP House Speaker Kevin McCarthy after his Sunday evening takeoff from Hiroshima. Biden opened his closing press conference in Hiroshima by sticking out a firm position in the debt talks. Republicans, he said, cannot strike a bipartisan deal solely on their partisan terms. He pivoted briefly to outline the foreign policy developments that emerged from meeting here, declaring that the summit showcased the unity of purpose within the G7. We are addressing the challenges that matter most of the world, he said. But the question and answer session that followed focused largely on the mess in Washington. It was one of several instances during his truncated trip to the Pacific that illuminated some pressures facing Biden's presidency and the approaches he has taken to counter them. His outward calm in a moment of chronic chaos, his persistent belief that the big picture matters more than the fleeting controversies, and above all, his success in unifying Americans alike while laboring to bridge divides at home. Despite being overshadowed by domestic news, this summit was historic, characterized by clear momentum building behind several multilateral initiatives and an increasingly cohesive alliance. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, unanticipated in-person attendance, coincided with new G7 endeavors to ensure his country withstands Russian aggression. The group articulated its strongest ever stance toward China's corrosive economic practices while accelerating a broader shift to a new industrial policy, an effort to reduce dependencies on Beijing by bolstering manufacturing and diversifying supply chains, expanding commitment to tackle climate change and lifting the developing world. But Biden's physical presence, his late arrivals, stiff gaze, and the beatific smile he wore during group photos was keenly observed by his counterparts, other diplomats, and the public. And some of the Japanese public following the summit and commenting in real time were not particularly lenient toward Biden, who sometimes appeared less energetic than his younger counterparts. During a group photo on Saturday, Biden didn't hear when he was called to take his place on a mark, forcing Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to yell to alert him. One European diplomat, speaking on condition of anonymity due to the sensitivity of the topic, said Biden looked okay but noted that he had to stick to the script quite a bit, reading from large notecards when it was his turn to speak during meetings. I don't think many European governments are very concerned, presumably because these crises come about quite often but never end in disaster, said Charles Grant, the director of the Centre for European Reform in London. Cutting short the trip is a bad signal, but there is such goodwill to Biden in most capitals that they are prepared to cut him some slack. It was meant to be a moment for the history books, the first time a U.S. president visited a Pacific island country. Papua New Guinea, the host nation, scrambled to mobilize 1,000 security officers. The leaders of 17 other countries agreed to make the trip just for a few hours with President Biden, who was scheduled to go on to a meeting in Australia with allies known as the Quad. What the cancellation means in the practice of terms is that America's domestic politics is undermining American foreign policy at a crucial time in a critical region. Analysts and diplomats warn that fears of an unreliable and dysfunctional America will now be revived in Asia and the Pacific, where the United States has only recently started to build momentum in its efforts to counter Chinese influence. It will reinforce lingering doubts about U.S. staying power, say Hal Brands, a professor of global affairs at Johns Hopkins University. And you can bet China will make hay of this. Its message to countries in the region will be, you can't count on a country that can't even perform basic functions of governance. American officials have framed the cancellation as a postponement, arguing that the last-minute change does not reflect a flagging commitment. We look forward to finding other ways to engage with Australia, the Quad, Papua New Guinea, and the leaders of the Pacific Islands Forum in the coming year, said a statement from the U.S. Embassy in Australia. The leaders of the Quad nations, the United States, Japan, India, and Australia, had planned to meet in Sydney, and Pacific Island leaders in Papua New Guinea. But for many, the American assurance carried a whiff of déjà vu. President Barack Obama skipped a planned appearance at an Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation meeting in 2013 to deal with a government shutdown instigated by Republicans. Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, went on to dominate the event, declaring that the Asia-Pacific cannot prosper without China. Doubts about American resolve and Mr. Obama's promise of a pivot to Asia have been in the air ever since, even as the Biden administration has offered tangible evidence of a shift in priorities. Along with more high-profile visits to the region, the United States has reopened an embassy in the Solomon Islands, added an embassy in Tonga, and titled its foreign policy heavily toward countering China, both militarily and in contested technologies like microchips. But Washington is still playing catch-up. Beijing diplomatic corps worldwide is now bigger than that of the United States and heavily concentrated in Asia. China has the world's largest navy and coast guard, and its state-owned companies have surged into the constructions and mining industries of many developing countries, including Fiji and Papua New Guinea, which sits just north of Australia. Ian Bremmer, the president of the unresolved Group, a global risk assessment firm, said Biden made the right call to cut his trip in half, but pulling out of the Quad summit shows the lack of reliability that the Chinese are only too happy about. Having said that, the G7 is extremely well-aligned, Bremmer said, attributing the cohesion to the crisis in Russia and shared concerns about China. Diplomats in Asia, where every geopolitical reverberation is examined for its impact on a wider strategic canvas, put a greater premium on American presidents showing up in person to bolster Washington's claim to be a key regional power. Diplomats in Asia, where every geopolitical reverberation is examined for its impact on a wider strategic canvas, put a greater premium on American presidents showing up in person to bolster Washington's claim to be a key regional power. So Biden's quick trip to Japan will be appreciated, but the shortened itinerary will still be a blow to U.S. prestige and will deepen concerns that U.S. domestic political instability will threaten U.S. global staying power. Meanwhile, on May the 17th, China's Global Times published an editorial suggesting that President Biden's decision to cancel visits to Australia and Papua New Guinea undermines the credibility of the United States. The article emphasized that when domestic issues overshadow the political agenda, the United States can easily turn its back on its commitments. For much of the region, especially the South Pacific, the United States has yet to prove that it can be as reliably present and productive as China. There's still a sense that this is early days, says Anna Paulus, a senior lecturer in security studies at Massey University in New Zealand. Trust is the currency of the Pacific, and building trust takes consistency. It takes being reliable, being there, being present. Abandoning a meeting of the Quad, which aims to foster collaboration on everything from healthcare to the environment, may be mostly a logistical irritant. Australia's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said on Wednesday that the four Quad leaders will try to meet on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Hiroshima. Mr. Biden's abort stop in Port Moresby, the capital of Papua New Guinea, may carry greater consequences. It's likely to delay or halt efforts to finalize a security agreement that, in early negotiations, involved the possibility of granting the U.S. military access to the lands and seas around a country that played a strategic role in World War II. Mr. Biden knows that history intimately. Two of his uncles fought there in the war and one was killed. Papua New Guinea's Prime Minister James Marab said this week that U.S. officials had also promised to deliver billions of dollars in infrastructure investments, and that a group of American executives had planned to join the president's entourage. It's not clear if or when these pledges will be fulfilled, a costly slide in a poor nation of 9 million people desperate for development, where China has already invested heavily in construction and mining. There is no way to deny that this is a big missed opportunity, said Derek Rossman, a senior defense analyst at the Rand Corporation. You can actually argue that going to Papua New Guinea for 3 hours is more important than going to the G7 or maybe even going to the Quad, because it's a new opportunity opening the door to all kinds of possibilities. And now that may be closing because of our own domestic situation. For the Pacific Island leaders who had been summoned to Port Moresby to meet with Mr. Biden, there won't be additional frustrations. The meeting was billed as a follow-up to their summit otherwise held last year, as many had specific requests to address, particularly on climate change, an existential threat to the region. They had prepared to leave their own domestic politics behind for the gathering, in some cases taking connecting flights to get there. Some, like Fiji's new Prime Minister Sitiveni Rabuka, have said in strong terms that they would work closely only with countries that share their values, distancing themselves from China in praise. But many leaders have also expressed annoyance with America's lack of focus when, for instance, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken went to Fiji and talked at length about Ukraine. or when other senior American officials were late for important regional meetings. Now their attention will shift back to China and to other rising power, India. Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who had planned a visit to Papua New Guinea before Mr. Biden committed and then cancelled, would now be the focal point in Port Moresby and in Sydney. Around 20,000 people are expected to gather in Sydney's Olympic Park for a bilateral celebration on Tuesday. Modi is still going to have a state visit in Australia, said Bet Grill, director of the Centre for Chinese Analysis at the Asia Society. He will be warmly welcomed. On Sunday, when Air Force One departed Japan and began the 14-hour journey home, there was a similar sense of ambiguity. Was the president living on a high after 3 days of substantive diplomatic achievements, or beleaguered, returning to a high-stakes political drama back home that seemed to be deteriorating? Biden said before the meeting started he was optimistic they could make some progress. Both sides need a bipartisan agreement to sell it to their constituencies, he said, adding there may still be some disagreements. Our program has come to an end now. Thanks for your attention and see you next time.